Just-in-time debugging is a feature of Visual Studio that allows you to attach a debugger to an application when two conditions are true. One, the app is not currently attached to a debugger and is not running outside of Visual Studio. Two, the application crashes. When you install Visual Studio, just-in-time debugging is enabled by default. Let me show you how to determine if it is enabled on your copy of Visual Studio. Look in this just-in-time node. There are 4 checkboxes in this dialog. Each one of them controls just-in-time debugging for one type of code. Since I'm working in C#, I'll make sure that I have these managed checkbox checks at the top. Before I leave this dialog, let me show you one other thing that you may have turned on or may not, depending on how you've set Visual Studio. That's this option, Enable Just My Code. What that means is that when you're debugging, you can only debug code that you've written and that you have the debug files for. So if you have a release build of your application, a normal release build, you will not be able to debug it using Enable Just My Code. So I'll turn this off in just a second. Right now I'll leave it on and show you what happens. So if I do a debug build of my application and start debugging, I get a normal debug session. If I choose the release build of my application and I choose start debugging, then I'll get this dialog. It tells me that I'm debugging a release build and that using just my code won't allow me to debug this. So I've got some choices. I can stop debugging. I can continue debugging but won't be able to hit my breakpoint or won't be able to get the exception assistant. Or I can disable just my code. This is the same as going back into that dialog, the settings options, and unchecking that checkbox. I can do it either way. So I'll stop debugging, switch over here, and I'll uncheck this for the rest of my demonstrations. All right, so here's the demonstrations I plan on showing you. I'll crash the application while I'm actively debugging with a debug build. Then I'll do several crashes outside of Visual Studio with different debug types. Debug, debug, release, and there's no PDB. And let me talk about those now. You can have multiple configurations in Visual Studio. They're listed in this dropdown. The normal 2 you get are debug and release, but I've added a third one here called no debug symbols. And if you look at the properties over here, let's see what's the difference between these 3. If you go to debug and you look at the advanced button, you'll see that the debug output is set to full. If you look at a release build, you'll see that that's set to a PDB only output. And if you look at the no debug symbols, you'll see that that's set to none. All right, let's see how this plays out. I'll start the application while I'm inside Visual Studio and I have my project open. So this will be just like a normal debug session. This is my Pixelsmith application. It's a photo editing application that allows me to apply certain filters to my images. Here's what the color tone filter looks like. Here's what the tune filter looks like. And here's what the monochrome filter looks like. I have a bug in my application. When I move my mouse around on the screen and I get too near the edge of this picture, it'll trigger an exception. Like that. Now because I'm using a normal debug session and I'm in a debug build, I get the exception assistant. I can look at the code through the exception. I can edit my code. I can move the yellow cursor around. I can use my breakpoint windows. I can use the auto windows and the watch windows and everything you know about debugging. I'll stop this. And the next thing I'll do is I'll run the application outside of Visual Studio. I'll leave Visual Studio open, but I'm going to run the application outside of Visual Studio. To do that, I'll right-click on this folder and choose Open Folder in File Explorer. And then I'm in this Pixelsmith folder. I'll go to the bin directory and you'll see that there's one folder for each build option I had in Visual Studio. So let's open up this debug folder and run this exe. So I'm running this outside of Visual Studio. There's no debugger attached. I trigger the exception. The application crashes, and because I had just-in-time debugging enabled, I get this extra button. We see this because we're developers. We have Visual Studio installed. We have just-in-time debugging installed. The end user would not see this. So I'm going to click on this debug button, and I'm given an opportunity to pick my debugger. Because I have 2 copies of Visual Studio on my computer, I can see that I can debug with either one of these. and I can also debug with the open instance of Visual Studio. So let's try this one first, this last one. It looks exactly the same as if I had started Visual Studio and run the debugger on this application. All right, so we'll stop that. I'll return back to File Explorer and run it again. Trigger the exception. Choose Debug. And this time I'll choose to open a new instance of Visual Studio. And look at that. Because I have my PDB file available, and because I did the just-in-time debugger, it looks exactly the same as if I'd had the project open, except, let's go look in the Solution Explorer. All the files are not there. What happened is the just-in-time debugger opened just the one file that I was editing. I don't have any of the rest of the project files available here. I try to move the cursor up to line 36. I get this dialog in Visual Studio that says unable to set the next statement because of item number 1. Debugging was started via just-in-time debugging. So yes, you can see the exception, but you can't move around too much in your code. So that's really all there is to the debugger. You get that additional button on the crash screen which lets you launch into Visual Studio. I could stop here, but I'd like to spend a couple minutes looking at how the JIT debugger works with release builds. So I'll close this copy of Visual Studio. And I'll open this release folder and run this exe. Trigger the exception. I'll get the same dialog as before. I can choose to debug. And if I choose the existing instance of Pixelsmith, I get the same behavior as before. I hit my breakpoint. And it looked good. I still can't move around in my code, but it hit my exception. So it's better than not being able to debug it at all. And let's try this again. I'll go back again and run this one more time. Trigger the exception. If I use the new instance of Visual Studio, I get the exception assistant. And it looks exactly the same as the debug build. So the last demonstration I want to talk about is if you do not ship the PDB. Now earlier in this course, in another of the videos, I talked about the importance of always having a PDB file. You should always have a PDB file of every public build of your application so that you can debug it. Let's see what happens if you don't have that PDB file. So it doesn't matter which of these instances, whether I choose to use a new instance of Visual Studio or whether I choose to use the one with the source code available. It doesn't matter which one I pick. All I get is the exception information. So I get the argument out of range exception. I can read some additional information about that, but I do not get the ability to see my source code. I do not get anything extra loaded in Solution Explorer.